Okay.
You're done putting it on, probably. Put on it, yeah. Unless we just. It's not crazy. Not that you didn't have it. Exactly. We left the front row of the band.
Yeah. Well, one thing to do. Things good on the days.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us tonight on this beautiful day, the start of a beautiful week. I'm so excited about this weather. I hope you all are too. Daylight savings is just around the corner as well. My name is Madeline. I'm the events coordinator here at Malaprops. Just want to welcome you all here, give you some housekeeping, and then introduce our guest tonight. Just a friendly reminder to silence your cell phones if you haven't already. We have two restrooms that are just down the hallway on the other side of this section. They take a code to get in, so you can just head to our back checkout counter and ask one of our booksellers, and they will print off that code for you. We also have, well, okay, this is a little bit more of the explanation for our books. So we have, I think we've already sold out of the books that we had in stock tonight. We had some limited books for sale. Denise has several books that she brought along that we are going to have her sell after the event. And once those sell out, we would encourage you all to still order through us. They should be getting in the next week, and we can call you to pick them up when they're ready, or we can also mail them to you. We are waiving our shipping fees so that we can encourage people to buy the book tonight. And Denise is actually going to be back in town in a couple weeks. So if you would like, if you want the book right away, just let us know. We'll ship it out immediately or call you for pickup. If you'd like it personalized or signed, we'll hang on to it for a couple weeks. And when Denise is back in town, we'll have her sign those. So, so sorry about that mix up, but we really would encourage any book sales. It helps our North Carolina debut author. It helps the indie bookstore, and it helps us continue to make these events possible. So just wanted to give a plug up for that. Our booksellers at the checkout counter can explain further and help you out, whether you'd like to pick up the book or have it shipped to you. We also have a live stream tonight, so thank you to everyone that's joining us online. I will send you some instructions on how you can send a question in, and also how you can order the book online. But thank you for joining us and tuning in. And lastly, I'll say, I feel like we probably had a fair amount of folks sign up for our newsletter or maybe found out about this event through our newsletter. If you are not part of our newsletter and you would like to stay in touch and hear about our upcoming events, we have some QR codes on our calendars around the store. We also have a link on our brochures. Feel free to take a photo or take a brochure with you and stay in touch with us and be aware of all of our upcoming events. We have many, many coming up in the store and out in the community. So we just like to plug that. I feel like that's probably the best way to hear about events these days. Social media can be a little distracting sometimes. So the newsletters tend to cut through the noise. So I just like to give a plug for that. All right, we are excited to host Denise Smith Cline tonight, presenting her debut historical fiction, The Resettlement of Vesta Blonik, in conversation with Heather Newton. Denise Smith Cline is an author and lawyer born and raised in upstate South Carolina. Her short stories and essays have won recognition and prizes, including a Pushcart Prize nomination. Her work has also appeared in Press 53 magazine, Mamalode, Carolina Woman, and the News and Observer, and The Shoal. The Resettlement of Vesta Blonik is her first published full-length novel. Denise currently resides in Raleigh, North Carolina. Heather Newton's novel, The Puppeteer's Daughters, won the North Carolina Indie Author Project Award for Adult Fiction, was a finalist for the Forward Indies Book of the Year Award, and has been optioned for television. Her short story collection, McMullen Circle, was a finalist for both the Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Award and the W.S. Porter Prize. A practicing attorney, she teaches creative writing for UNC Asheville's Great Smokies Writing Program and Charlotte Lit, and is co-founder and program manager for the Flatiron Writer Center in Asheville. Please join me in welcoming Denise Smith Cline and Heather Newton. Thank you, Madeline, and thanks, Malaprops. It's always wonderful to be in Malaprops bookstore, wouldn't you say? Absolutely. And I am thrilled to be here with my pressmate from Regal House, Denise. And even before Denise sold the book to Regal House, she and I have had conversations about this book. So I've been waiting with great anticipation for it to come out in a form where I can actually feel it. It feels really good. So please do order the book tonight. Don't wait. Denise, do you want to just give us a little elevator pitch about what the book is about, and then we'll go from there?
You know, that's the hard part. But before I do that, first of all, thank you all. I have family here. I have my daughter here, her colleagues here. There may be some people I haven't met before. Thank you so much. When you do these events and you see friendly faces in the crowd, it makes it so much easier. And I want to shout out to this woman who is, you heard the introduction, she is literary Asheville celebrity. And you heard the books that she's written. She's got another book coming out in a couple of years with the same publishing house. And she did help me with this. She did review this book for me. And she has also helped me with the book that is under the bed that hopefully someday will see the light of day. But she and Maggie and the Flatiron Writing Room on Haywood, that right in West Asheville, off Haywood, is wonderful, and it's an inspiration. And I know Heather has also taught at Charlotte Lit and other places, so I am totally honored to be with Asheville literary, celebrity. So thank you, Heather.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll take.
Buy her book. So I got lucky on this story because so many writers struggle for something to write about and a story, and how to make it happen and how to move it forward and make it propulsive. And this story got handed to me some years ago. A friend of mine, just like a coffee, middle of the day, said, my aunt and uncle, and he told me the story of his aunt and his uncle, a North Carolina man, had lost his wife and baby. And his family wrote to this woman that they did not know in Minnesota to get her to come south to marry him. She did not realize until she got here that he was in Dorothea Dix, the mental institution, which is probably a red flag. So that story was handed to me. My friend continued to sip his coffee like, that's just my people. I'm like, what? So that story sort of stuck with me for a long time, and I was working on another novel. And but I began to think to myself, the story that this is inspired by, and I want to be very clear that the characters in the resettlement are completely made up. And Heather, I don't know whether you've had this experience or not, but sometimes, you strive for a character, and sometimes they just come knocking on the door. And most of these characters just came knocking on the door. But anyway, I thought, what would make a woman, even in the middle of the Depression, do this? Go 1,000 miles on a train, with nothing, to marry a man she's never met. And so that's when I began to do some of the historical research, which is really fun. And I learned that at that same time period in Minnesota, there was the first New Deal project that Roosevelt came up with was called the Resettlement Administration. And the point of the Resettlement Administration was to move farmers from bad, unsustainable farms to better farms. And so that became, as we say, the inciting incident. And the very first few pages, if you read the book or will read the book, is Vesta Blonik, my character, receives a visitor. A man comes to town, as it were. He happens to be a government man. And in the middle of the Depression, when a government man comes knocking on the door, it's bad news, right? And so that became part of my story. And then the other part of the story is the man in North Carolina. Heather and I are both, Heather used to live in Raleigh. I live in Raleigh now. And the mental institution in Raleigh was Dorothea Dix Hospital. And now in Raleigh, it is a city park. It's a magnificent park, and you should come to Raleigh. I know, but still, you should come to Raleigh. I tell people from other counties that North Carolina is like the EU. You know, you don't need a passport. You can just drive straight through. It's, you know, we don't stop you at the border, but it's just a magnificent park now. But of course, in those days, it was the only mental institution in North Carolina. And maybe Broughton was around at that time, but it is, these mental institutions are haunted places, even now. They're usually up on a hill. And there's a vibe there that, you know, even after they put a wonderful playground there, you can't.
No amount of sage will
Yeah,
cure.
right. But anyway, so that became my story, and I did the research, and then I began to write the story. And I wanted to be like the woman who has written this fabulously successful book, which I have not yet read, The Correspondence. I wanted to do it only by letters. I couldn't make it happen. So I had to make this, you know, the narrative part. So that is the long-winded answer of how this came to be.
Great, that's wonderful. It has inspired by a true story written all over it, and I'm glad to hear exactly where that came from. I didn't know how that came across your desk, so that's awesome. Yeah, when Denise started, when we first talked about this novel, when you were still working on it, I think,
Yes.
and you mentioned that it was set partly at Dick's Hospital, that was intriguing to me as a Raleighite, because when I was growing up, Dick's was an active mental hospital, and when I was in the 6th grade, my school bus went through the Dick's campus every day to pick up the kids of medical staff who lived on campus. They lived there. So, and the kids were very tough when it came to like being teased for living at a mental institution. They had like learned how to deal with that. But yeah, so very intriguing that you decided to set it on the Dick's campus.
Well, and it's partly set in Minnesota, and I don't know whether I've told you this, Heather, or not, but right when it was beginning to germinate, I had the novel that I was working on that is now under the bed, not literally, but in Google Drive. And my college roommate she's very interested in theater. And she, fortunately for me, has a husband who is not interested in particularly Shakespeare, right? And I love Shakespeare. So she called me in February of 2020 and said, "Do you want to go with me to the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis?" I'm like, "Sure." I'm from South Carolina. I'm from Greer, right down the road. And when we arrived in Minneapolis in February of 2020, it was 6 below. And I had a lot of work before she actually got involved to do in cemeteries and, you know, little small towns and that kind of thing. And that really helped me because I realized that part of the setting in this book is way up north in Minnesota. And the setting is these shanties. And they're made of tar paper and pieces of wood and, you know, a little bit of tin tacked on. And recently, you know, we've had some difficult times in Minnesota and it's been like 30 below. But even 6 below, I just wanted to just sink into the snow and die. But it really helped me to see that part of the world in the winter and imagine what this poor woman, who I made up, had to deal with in those times. And she loses almost everything. And so she's very desperate to find a way to live because her family betrays her and abandons her. And back in North Carolina, the man who was in Dorothea Dix is also betrayed by his family. And he's committed because of, frankly, grief. Or that's what we think, it's sort of ambiguous. But yeah.
You said that most of your characters just kind of came to you, and I love the character of Vesta. She's, you know, this is 1937. She doesn't have the assets that a woman needed in 1937 to survive, either a husband, looks, money. She had nothing like that. But she's a wonderful, compelling character, and I'm curious how she did come to you, like everything about her, how she looked, and how she managed to persevere through all the nonsense that she had to put up with no support to speak of.
Well, I mean, I don't know how to say this in any other way, but I made her 30 years old and unmarriageable. She's a large woman. She had never had a flirtation really with a man or a decent man. She was stuck on the farm. She was busy. There's a lot to do on a farm, and she'd sort of given up on the flirtations. She had given up on that idea that she had. And so when she began to get those letters from a stranger, even if it was a stranger, And even though he didn't write them, she didn't know that. She thought, somebody is asking me the color of my eyes, and that had never happened to her before. And so she did come to me, and people have asked sometimes, you know, let's just say when they make the movie.
Talk about casting.
Right, no, but if they should make the movie, have y'all watched, Call the Midwife? It's, my daughter's here and we both use Call the Midwife for like therapy. Sometimes when everything's going wrong, we watch Call the Midwife. But there is a character, Chumley, something like that. Miranda Hart, look her up. She is destined to play Vesta Blonik. And I don't mean to aim high about this, but Gordon is kind of a handsome guy. He's kind of the prince of his family. I'm thinking Jude Law. But to answer your question further, they do come to me. And the minor characters, one of the things that I realized when I put this woman in this terrible place and I put this man in this terrible place is they need friends. They need friends. And the friends truly came to me, like the guy in the mental hospital from the Outer Banks. I needed somebody to have that Outer Banks accent. And he happened, unknown to me, to be a Bible expert. And he had gone through the Bible to find out if it was okay to play cards. The Bible says nothing about playing cards. And so he came to me too. And it's a wonderful thing. You've had this happen.
I have had this happen.
Yeah, and we're both lawyers, we're both very rational people, and knock on the door.
That's right. Well, what I love about Vesta is, yes, she likes the letters, but she has no romantic notions whatsoever. It's just that her current situation is dire. Her father makes this deal to relocate and get the government money and make no provision for her whatsoever. Her brother would love to help, but he's already struggling, he and his wife, and she's really on her own. So she's a very practical person. And yet it turns out, I won't spoil it, but because she's such a kind person and worthy of friendship and worthy of love, then, it's not tragic in the end. We'll just say that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of perseverance that has to go on here. And it's also a book about relationships. I'm fascinated by the idea of arranged marriages, which this kind of was. And sometimes, of course, arranged marriages become stronger than love marriages because people find qualities in each other that they need to appreciate. And then sometimes that doesn't happen in love marriages or doesn't last in love marriages. And it's also a story about relationships that start in deception, or at least with things that are hidden, and then what you do about that and how you deal with that. And I found as I wrote that piece, those parts, to be fascinated by those ideas.
Yeah, I've heard you do interviews about this book, and one of the things that I love that you said is that even when you marry someone that you think you know, and you marry for love and you've known them a while, you're going to find things out about them as you go along that weren't on their Facebook profile or whatever. So in a way, it's kind of a universal thing to be surprised by and then have to negotiate and think about, do I accept that in this person, or do I leave? How do I react to that? That's a really rich thing to mine in a piece of fiction.
Well, and my children, one of whom is here, sorry. When I first began to talk about this book, they said, "Oh, this is catfishing." I had no idea what that meant, but it's a great shortening element for an elevator speech. Usually, I'm like, this is a catfishing story set in the Great Depression. Done.
That is good. So yes, we are both lawyers. And so I know how challenging it is to find time to write and find time for a creative life while running a practice. We have a lot in common.
It's
like
true.
We're both employment lawyers.
Yeah.
And we're both like own our own practices, or at least I just retired, but Denise still owns her own practice.
Braggart.
Yeah. So how did you do? It's tough. It's not a job you can leave at home. At night when you go, you're still worrying and the cogs are still moving or whatever. So how did you do it?
Well, Heather, you know that being a lawyer is, you get to see people at their worst and their best. And so it's in some ways a great laboratory for being a writer, and there are a lot of lawyers who are writers. I do have the benefit of being my own boss, and so I can sort of manage my time. For many years, I have been part of a writing group in Raleigh or the Triangle area. And we meet every Monday, and if you're a lawyer and you've gone through all the schooling and all that, you are very sensitive to deadlines. And so this writing group, we are asked to bring each Monday for an hour and a half, which is not that much time, 10 pages. And so that deadline just worked on me. And so I really decided that I was going to show up every Monday morning. First, we were meeting in person, then COVID, and then we're now meeting by Zoom. And even now, if I don't have 10 pages on that Monday morning, I feel like I failed. So I did find a way to write for them. I read a lot on the weekends. I find sometimes that even an hour a day is enough to keep me going. One of the things that's hardest for me is when it's been a while. I don't usually have writer's block, but I have like writer's despair. It's like, this is terrible. Where can you go? So I have a lot of words, as you can tell, but sometimes they're not good words.
Well, I do think being your own boss as a lawyer can be a bonus when you're trying to write, because you're not accountable to partners for how you spend your time, and you really can manipulate it a little bit.
Manipulate.
Say
manipulate?
But yeah, when you're self-employed, like you can maybe stop taking cases for a week or two if things are busy, and buy yourself some time away to a conference to write,
That's
things like that.
That's right.
I know you still do litigation. I started out doing employment discrimination, and I think my last jury trial was when I was randomly pregnant with my daughter. I remember because I ran out of maternity clothes that would fit, that would be appropriate for my last jury trial. But it's a little harder with litigation. You don't have quite the control over your schedule.
That's right. And as you know, Heather, it comes and goes. There are periods in which you're extremely busy, and then there are periods when you're like, I will never work again. And you just have to remember, over the long haul, you will work again and you will get it done. And I think the only thing that can help that is experience. That you've done. I've been doing this. I've had my own practice for, I'm embarrassed to say, 16 years. So it takes a long time before you get the rhythm right.
Yeah.
So
Why do you think so many lawyers are closet writers? We know a lot.
yeah, I mean, and one of the things that I mentioned before, I think, is that especially, well, neither Heather nor I does domestic work. And that's when you get the calls at 11 o'clock at night over the potted plant and who has custody of the plant. You don't want to practice that if you can help it. Employment law is the next level, because it's about self-worth. It's about who these people are as a person. They're often newly out of the job, or discriminated against or something like. So it is not quite the potted plant at midnight, but there's a lot of emotion. And in that way, I think you can really feel directly how you help people. But you ask about lawyers, and I think we see those human sides a lot. I also think there's a natural tendency to have precision with words. And we also are storytellers in our practices.
Yeah,
You get before a judge, you get before a jury, you're like, here's the story. Yeah.
And I think being a lawyer gives you a kind of a window into other people's lives. It's kind of a voyeur type thing.
Totally.
Where, like with employment law, I know a lot about people's jobs. Like I know what a manufacturing plant is like, because I've had so many clients who work in manufacturing. Were there things that you found that you put in your novel that you knew because you had practiced law?
I didn't really think about the law when I was doing this, except this only thing, which is that in the Depression, nobody had jobs. But I do think that people they show themselves to you, especially as in employment law cases. And I think that a lot of people have their whole self-image in their jobs. And I used to tell people that employment law is sex lies and videotapes. And because people would call me-
Literally.
yeah, people would call me and they're like, oh, thank God. And they would be like, let me close the door. And you're like, okay. So you do see a human side, and you also, we're rational people. We have to be rational people. And so fitting those sort of emotional contexts within words is kind of what we do.
Well, I'm glad you did find time to write it. It's such a good book. It's such a wonderful book. So you're from South Carolina,
I am.
but you seem to have adopted North Carolina. There's such wonderful information in here about what North Carolina was like in the Depression in the 30s, what the farming families were doing when they weren't like catfishing.
Right.
So did you have to do any research for that, or do you come from a background of rural farmers?
Well, I don't come back from a background of rural farmers. My brother is here, and he's been sweetly to several of my readings. And there is Vesta has to take care of a lot of livestock. And Mark's heard the story. Some of you have heard the story, but my brother said after he read the book, he said, "Have you ever milked a cow?" And the answer is no, I have not milked a cow. But that same brother had was a member of a scout troop. And the scout troop had a quote farm day. And my dear, elegant, wonderful mother and my father grew up on farms. And so we went to the farm day, and there was a cow, but the cow was very one-dimensional because it was made of plywood. And there was a rubber glove for the udder, and there was a milking contest. And I was maybe 13, the worst possible time. And my mother, in her little elegance, won the milking contest. So I don't have that kind of experience, but I do. I am from a small town, and from a small town, you learn so many things about other people that sometimes you don't want to know. And there's some things in the story about Raleigh in particular that I really enjoy getting to know. There's some scenes from the old Sir Walter Raleigh Hotel, and of course Dick's. And one of the characters in the book is the younger brother of Gordon, who is in the mental institution. And his name is Burgess, because I grew up in Burgess Hills. His name is Burgess, and Burgess was not cut out for farming. And so he managed somehow to get a job in downtown Raleigh in the middle of the Depression, which was something. And so he's the kind of man who at the Thanksgiving dinner table will tell you about various insurance products. The things that you need to make sure that you were covered and that kind of thing. And so for some reason, I've just loved thinking about him and this little family-owned insurance company, and they close it at noon on Wednesday, which is certainly what happened in my small town. So I think some of these things are not necessarily about Raleigh, but they're about the South, and they're about small towns, and they're about, how we are.
Yeah. One character that I especially like, she just kind of added some spark to Vesta's life after she came down in North Carolina, is the sister, Gordon's sister.
Oh yeah, Clara.
So she has taken up seamstressing.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
So are you a seamstress?
God, no. My daughter's a seamstress, but the reason that I'm not a seamstress, my mother taught me how to be a seamstress. I took home ec, which you had to do. I don't do sewing because my language is so bad when I sew. I think words I didn't even know come out when I sew. But thank you for asking. Thank you for thinking that I might be.
Well, you did good research on it.
Well, I want to speak just for a minute about the fun of doing some historical research, which is that, all these things that you think you take for granted when, it happened that amount of time ago. And, like she encountered, my character encounters a zigzag machine, because, I'm around sewing machines enough to know that there was zigzag stitch. And so I had to look up, was there a zigzag stitch in 1937? And one of the characters, the guy from the Outer Banks, I had him playing. I'm also not a card player, also know nothing about livestock. But the card player, I had him playing canasta, and then I looked it up and realized that canasta wasn't invented until the 40s. So the thing about historical research is that you have to really do it.
Yeah, you do. And there's a lot of brackets when you're writing in first
Yeah.
draft of a novel. You're like, hopefully you don't stop and do the research or never get your novel done.
Right.
But yeah, it's like, can I do this?
Right.
It's not a question of like, should it be accurate? It's a question of what can I get away with?
Exactly, exactly. And sometimes you just hope nobody says, you know, what is there? No, whatever. So,
Yeah. That's right.
yeah, so.
Well, I love Vesta's character. Gordon's nice too, but he's like not as deep. Like he's, you know, a bit privileged. He's kind of lucky that his family deceived him in this way. And now he's got a steady presence of Vesta. What do you think happens when the book ends and they walk off the page? I want to know what happens to Vesta.
I bet you do. I'm not sure exactly, but probably, you know, I think, you know, all kinds of things happened in this novel that had nothing to do with the characters. You know, these economic events, the worst economic times our country and probably the world has ever known. And people come up to me all the time to say, do you think the Depression was worse than the Recession? And my parents were Depression era people. Heavens, yes. I mean, it was impossible times. It was just incredibly impossible times. Another really impossible time is coming up, which is World War II. And the book with war clouds looming. And so we'll see. There's a lot that, you know, we could do.
Yeah. Good.
So.
I look forward to you exploring that. That sounds wonderful. Would you like to read a little teeny tad? Or
I'll read just a bit because I think it's I'm going to read a little section. I mentioned Burgess because Burgess is somebody who is kind of pulled into this drama. You know, he's, like I said, he's hapless. But I wanted to, and one other thing I wanted to say is the book is now, if you're interested, in audio. And I got a chance to listen to the narrators who were going to do the audio. And they were all reading from the North Carolina section. So I got to assess the North Carolina accent, which I understand the North Carolina accent. The Minnesota part I didn't get to hear. And so this part I'm going to read to you because I can't do a Minnesota accent is from North Carolina. And this is from the brother of Burgess, and he's horrified that people in the insurance agency where he's working are going to find out that he has a brother in the crazy house. And so he's trying to sort of balance making visits to keeping the news about his brother at Duke's quiet. So this is from October 1937 in Raleigh. And I'll read just a bit. There's a letter in here. So I wish, like I said, that I had been this woman who's written the correspondence and it had all been letters, but oh well. Here we go. Burgess frowned. He's at work. As always, the Findlay agency closed on Wednesday afternoon at 12:30 sharp. At 12:45, Burgess Crenshaw still sat at his desk, head bent toward his work, until Ron Fairley Jr., the younger Raleigh son, took his hat on the stand and said, "Burgess, I'm sure whatever you're working on can wait until tomorrow. It's almost 1 o'clock." Burgess frowned, hoping to communicate both diligence and disappointment at having to stop work. He looked at his watch and made a surprised face. "Goodness, Ron, can you believe how time flies?" Ron's expression stayed blank. He opened the door and went outside. Burgess had put off visiting his brother at Dix Hill as long as he could. He'd never been to a mental hospital before, and he still had trouble believing his parents, sister, and brother had had his older brother, Gordon, committed. The hill leading up to the hospital was steep, and Burgess stopped to wipe his forehead on his handkerchief, and for what felt like the 100th time, pulled from his pocket Clara's letter from several weeks before. The letter's dated October 7th, 1937. "Dear Burgess, things have come to a pretty pass here. No doubt Mama's given you an earful about poor Gordon this and poor Gordon that. They are up in arms about what we've had to do, but my conscience is clear as a bell. You were down for Miriam's and the baby's funerals, but I wager Mama hasn't told you the rest. How after the funerals and everyone left, Gordon just sunk into himself. He got rail thin, not eating a bit of what we fixed, moping around without washing or cleansing himself, like something the cat drug up from the yard. One day, we even sent Margie and their little Billy over with some cookies. You know Margie, chatters like a chipmunk. But she said Gordon took one look at the little boy before he walked out and slammed the door behind him. He started walking out, Gordon did, late at night. One night, Jim saw him with the light up at the Barnett's old barn, and sure enough, there was Gordon. Jim said he'd been sitting on a bench outside the old barn with a shotgun propped up against his leg, butt end on the ground. He was holding a stick, a little narrow one that Jim said you could use to pull down the trigger. I asked, did Gordon actually have the gun pointed at him, or was it just resting there? Jim looked at me hard and said there was no question at all about Gordon's intent. Said Gordon tried to run him off from up at the Barnetts. Jim said Gordon told him he could go to HELL. Sorry. That the days weren't worth it anymore, nothing was. It's not like I haven't felt like that. My dogs. It's not like I haven't felt like that. But then again, I don't lock myself up and not eat or bathe for weeks on end. Jim took it to mean that Gordon wanted to hurt himself. I told him I'd back him up. My conscience is clear as a bell. You being the youngest, I don't know if you ever appreciate how Gordon has not ever had one hard thing happen to him. Not like the rest of us. He even got to go up to Chapel Hill for a little bit after the banks failed. Oh, sorry, until the banks failed. Also, Dad and Jim building that little house for him and Mimi. Gordon paid not a dime on it, at least as far as I know. Jim can be hard and mean as a snake, but he's stuck farming this tired old dirt farm and set to inherit the worst of its fields. That is if we can keep the place. And I don't have to remind you of my many difficulties and afflictions. Anyway, Jim told Mom and Daddy, and they called Dr. McNeil. Before you know it, they had a truck out there and some large men to put him in the jacket. Gordon fought until he couldn't anymore. Neither Mama nor Daddy tried to stop it. Even if Mama says she did, she only stood over there on the side, weeping and going on like she does. Anyway, we did what we could. This is a long letter, but you have a right to know. Mama goes on and on about you taking care of Gordon up there in Raleigh. So I expect you ought to get up there to see him. Burgess knew he had to do his brotherly duty. It was only natural that he felt a little hesitant due to his unfamiliarity with the mentally unstable. After a 10-minute walk, the rambling main house the building came into view. It was an imposing 5 stories high, faced with yellow stucco. Burgess was surprised to see patients on the porch, scattered on the lawn. Some of the men were talking to each other, wearing shirts and slacks, seeming like regular fellows. But as Burgess got closer, he saw several men were in wheelchairs, their faces blank and heads drooping to their chests, mouths gaping. 2 of the men were strapped into their chairs, eyes unfocused. Sorry. One man looked awfully sad, but the others had big grins pasted on their faces. One man was singing pretty loudly, but it was a song or something that Burgess did not know. On the wide front porch, Burgess removed his hat and straightened his tie. Remember, you never got a second chance to make a good first impression.
Yeah, I would say one poignant thing about this book is how clearly it illustrates the attitude towards mental illness at that time. And honestly, it may not have evolved all that much since then, but just this man was suffering from horrible depression from the loss of his child and his wife, and winds up in a mental institution and then doesn't quite behave himself. And so the threat is that he'll be subject to some of the more extreme and barbaric treatments if he doesn't get out. So Vesta is, in a sense, saves him from that.
Right.
But yeah, it's really wonderful how you wove in the history of mental treatment from that time. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because you can't really there's some laws and so forth in place. You can't get mental records for 100 years. So I have no access to records until 2037 for what was really going on. But and you know, the Dick's Hospital was close to 70 years old when this story is said. And so there had been a lot of changes and so forth, but it was like Broughton, a place that even now when I do these readings, people come up, pull me aside and whisper that they had an aunt or a grandmother, often a woman, who was institutionalized, because you could be sent to Dix or Broughton, certainly if you had severe mental illness, but also if you were, in these times, if you had epilepsy, or if you were albino, or if you were a disappointing wife, or if you were a religious zealot. And so the standards, we have certainly not cracked the nut on mental illness, but they had not cracked it then either.
Well, this is just an aside, but so when growing up in Raleigh, when you tell somebody they're crazy, they're going to Dorothea Dix. And there in Raleigh, there is a high school, a prominent high school called Broughton High School. Some of y'all may be familiar with, you may played them in sports or something. So then I moved to Western North Carolina, and I mentioned to somebody that my sisters had gone to Broughton. And here at this end of the stage, if you go to Broughton, that's not a good thing, and because the hospital at this end of the state is Broughton Hospital. So I thought,
well, interestingly, tonight we went to the Taco Temple, and Amelia, my daughter, who went to Broughton, saw somebody in the crowd who also was from Raleigh and got all sorts of reaction because she had gone to Broughton, not because of the hospital, but because it was ITB. You know what that means? Inside the Beltline.
oh, of course, of course.
Anyway,
Sorry.
so, but in South Carolina, it was Bull Street. That's where people were sent. And I had, with work in the last year, the opportunity to go to Bull Street, which is also completely renovated. They had this baseball stadium and these lovely high-end condos, I guess, and just very different from the Bull Street that we used to taunt. I never did, but others used to taunt.
I never made fun of anybody either. That's like, yeah, we went down to Flannery O'Connor's house near Milledgeville, Georgia, this past spring, and got to see that mental institution, which has not been turned into condos. It's like abandoned with like the windows busted out. It's an enormous former mental hospital. It's just the whole concept of those huge institutions. It's pretty sobering when you're walking around the campus.
It really is, and Dix, now that it's a park, it's alive with all sorts of activity and art and so forth. But they haven't figured out quite yet what to do with the big old hospital. And there's still bars on the window, and these stories of ghosts. And I think as long as there's a mental hospital up on a hill like that, like Broughton or like Dix, those stories are going to continue.
Well, that's probably a good thing, because then you can write the next one. Yeah. Great. What have you enjoyed most about being a debut author?
Well, honestly, I'm pretty old to be a debutante. But no, it's been wonderful. One of the things that is so great, and I know that you and Maggie have sort of helped me with this process, is finding the doors open. There's so many wonderful writers out there who are supportive and kind and instructive, and it's odd to be, at this stage of my life and finding these new friends and I have found that writers are incredibly, welcoming and collegial and helpful. And there's a community. I mean, once you become, even just a little bit like me, a part of it, you feel like, paying it forward, because there's lots of favors that you have to ask other writers like you. Thank you. And it is just it's very gratifying to be part of a community.
I completely agree with that. It took me a long time to learn that, because I am a lawyer and I'm type A, and I was like, oh, the goal is the thing, not the friendships. And so like nose to the grindstone, get your novel done. And I was really way late in life before I realized that I needed to look up and look around at the community and realize that at the end of the day, it's the friends you make and the travel opportunities. Almost my entire social life revolves around writers and writing, and that's so much more long lasting than even publication or great fame and fortune. So I try to, when I talk to young writers, I try to prevent them from making the same mistake that I did.
Well, and it is not a avocation or vocation for sissies, because there's lots of rejection. And there's lots of times when you are just like, why am I doing this? And that's when you find your friends who are going through the same thing and have these amazing stories, or not, they're just in the trenches with you. And the other thing that I think is really wonderful is, you get to a certain point and you think you have your friends, you have your job, you have your family. And, this kind of new thing is like a whole new world. Plus, oh my God, Instagram. I've had to learn so much more because as lawyers, we don't have to, we're sort of, everybody sort of frowns on marketing.
Yeah.
You don't see Heather and me on billboards, right? But in the writing world, you're supposed to, by God, get out there on social media. And my family's been helpful. I have a friend in Raleigh who's been helpful. I'll post something and they're like, you misspelled. No. Or Amelia will say, my daughter's here. She'll say, you posted that 8 times. So it takes a village. I have one more quick story that I'll tell you about. So there is a cow in the book who becomes a special friend of Vesta. And I was trying to do, I told this story over dinner, but I was trying to come up with content, as they say, for Instagram, and I was doing a reel, and I thought I'd get my darling and precious dog to help me talk about non-human friends, right? And so at the 25th take, my dog is like, help me. So that you'll not see that.
And when they have animals in the movies, they usually have 2 that look alike, so they can trade them off.
Well, one of my helpers in publicity said, never forget, if you have a child or a dog, nobody's gonna pay attention to you, so.
This is very good advice. Yeah, very good advice. How are we doing on time? Is it time for any questions? Okay. We'll take questions from the real people first, I suppose.
Hi, how are you? Can you tell us how she got her name, about her name?
Yes, I can. And it's a wonderful, magical story. It's not.
Repeat the question.
Okay, sorry. The question is how I got the name Vesta Blonik. I guess that's the question. So, I wish I had a magical story. The real story is I went to the Social Security website and looked up the most popular name for Czech Americans in 1905. And also there's a place at the beach that sells lime pies and also buoys, misspelled buoys, but nonetheless, lime pies. And her name is Vesta. So I thought, yes, that's the name. And then I did a reading recently in Raleigh, and there's a woman who taught Latin at Broughton. You may have, well, I think she was probably
I'm old.
yeah, but anyway, she was iconic. And they don't teach Latin at Broughton anymore, but she was so iconic that she got away with calling herself Dea, goddess. And so it was like her name was Dea Holt, and so she was the Latin teacher. So I gave this presentation in Raleigh, and Jennifer Holt, now Kate's, was there, and I gave the same explanation, and she said, "Did you realize that the Roman goddess of hearth and home is named Vesta?" I'm like, no, but that is going to be my story. But I'm being honest and saying it's Social Security.
It's a great name. It just personifies her character so wonderfully.
Well, and it was so fun to actually do research in Minnesota about some of these small towns, which really are filled with, Eastern Europeans and Scandinavians, and was back there this summer as well, and realized that so many of these small towns have 2 churches. They have a Lutheran church and they have a Catholic church.
Yeah.
And in this story, this family who was Czech were Catholic, but the only Catholic church they could go to in the town was an Irish Catholic church. And so they had to listen to an Irish Catholic, priest speak in Latin, which is what they were doing then. But there was a little bit of prejudice unless you were Irish. And, that's one of the things I encountered when I did some research. And to go to a Czech Catholic church, they would have had to travel 30 miles. And so they didn't, so, but those kind of things were so fun to figure out and doing these little bits of research.
Yeah, research can be fun.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm looking over here at Kieran, who let me interview her for my novel that's coming out from Regal House in a couple of years. Yeah, she told me how things really work with, pregnancy and stuff like that. And then I completely pushed it to the limit and have taken literary license with it, which is you're allowed to do as a writer. But you do the research and then you're like, what can I get away with?
Well, Karen is a mentor for my daughter, so I'm taking it from her that, whenever if I ever write a story about pregnancy, that, I get the story right, so.
And since you can't get records from Dix for 100 years, how did you do your research for what it was like during that time?
So other states don't have these same laws. And so, but for example, there's a hint of, we know that they were doing some form of shock therapy at the time. The first lobotomy occurred, you can find this out easily, is in the United States, because it, was sort of invented or whatever in Europe, was in 1935. So don't know what was happening at Broughton at the time, at Dix at the time. But so I sort of left in the book that it was a threat. We don't know whether that really happened or not. But there's a fair amount of stuff about the kinds of mental illnesses that were being treated. There was a wonderful book that I recommend if you are interested in Dorothea Dix, and what they did was, it's called Haven on the Hill. And I've drawn a lot of the research I've done about Dix. Dix is a fascinating place, and Dorothea Dix was a fascinating woman. She started doing, her work as a reformer in mental health is sort of responsible for creating mental institutions in 15 states and Canadian provinces. And she started with doing surveys of what the status of mental health was in the mid-19th century. And she found people in cages and pens and chained in jails. And so her work really changed the landscape of mental health in this country. So, any other questions? Courtney.
How would you say the models that you have, your parents or your own relationships or whatever, shaped how you navigated the developing relationship once Vesta got to care?
So the question is, this is my niece who's asking me this question, so I have to be very careful. The question is how my own experiences, family and otherwise, shaped the experience of Vesta. And the love relationship. And so, whenever, I think this is truly an arranged marriage. And so I think these individuals who are in this arranged marriage, which of course, in my parents and your grandparents, they had a love relationship. But I think at a certain point, what you look to and what you rely upon are not the necessarily chemistry between the two, but the values, the kindness, the attention to what the other person needs. And so I think that is sort of how this has evolved. And I don't know that I drew from my parents as much about that. Although, one of the things that that did influence me was, my mother she came to South Carolina, where I'm from. She was a teacher, and she wanted to be like this, traveling teacher all over the world. And she came engaged to a man who she met in college, and she would send him letters, and he would, this is remarkable, he would send them back to her corrected. And that's why my mother married my father. So I owe that stranger my life and your life. But my mother was from Tennessee, and she wrote religiously to her sisters. And the tone of those letters influenced greatly my understanding about how people wrote to each other and what sisters, which she had a sister-in-law, and what they said to each other and what was important, and how they managed subtly to convey much deeper things when they talked about recipes and, the weather and what was happening. So.
The sister-in-law was one of my favorite ancillary characters.
Yeah,
I loved her as well.
Yeah, and she also was struggling because her sister-in-law was the daughter of German immigrants. And even in the 30s, from the First World War, German, people who spoke with a German accent and so forth were not welcome. And of course, with the war coming up, it got much worse and, they called, I learned things like they called sauerkraut, German slaw or something like that. It was just like, it was like freedom fries back in then. And, you couldn't walk out with a dachshund because people would like, whatever. So, but she had her own struggles. And she was the closest thing that Vesta would ever have to a sister and friend, so. Any other questions? Maggie?
Now that you've been through the whole process of completing your book and having it published, are you at all tempted to go back to the novel that's under the bed? Or do you want to move on to something else? Or do you want to work on a follow-up to this and the Warriors?
Well, I'm of two minds. I'm terrified to go back to the novel Under the Bed because it was several years ago and I'm like, surely I'm better, now. So that's scary. The novel that is Under the Bed was inspired by what happened in my hometown. We were in the middle of desegregation in when, the court orders came down to bus and so forth. And it was a thing where the court orders came down and within 2 weeks, busing began. And in my very small town, the weekend that things were supposed to fall into place, there was a big snowstorm and someone burned our junior high to the ground. My old friend is here. She's nodding. I told it right.
Yes, you did.
And so that novel was set in a small town in the Carolinas in the middle of desegregation. And, it's finished, but it was right when Black Lives Matter happened. And I thought, this is the wrong time.
Yeah.
So it's probably gonna stay on the bed until, for a while, until either I rewrite it or get the courage to try to get back out there. So, but it's still, it's still a little drive, so.
I have so many under my bed that I think it's holding up my bed. Nothing is wasted though, you do get better with practice. It's like any other art. or
Let us hope.
practice.
Yeah. I have a friend who now passed, but he had a novel in the mid-90s and then wrote another one in the teens. And they did, whoever was publishing it did a twofer. They published both of them at the same time. And I said, John, this is maybe the difference between a woman writer and a male writer, sorry. But I said, John, are you worried about going back and looking at what you wrote all that time ago? And John's like, no. You know who I'm talking about, so. But no, I'm very worried about what it looks like. I'm terrified. So, in fact, I've confessed this to my family. There is an audiobook, and I got to pick the narrator, but I've been too scared to listen to the audiobook because I'm just like, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I've never listened to the audiobook of mine either. If there is something about it, it's just like. Yeah.
And my only goal, and I've said this before too, was I only heard the candidates for the narration do the Raleigh accent or the North Carolina accent. And my only goal was the least cheesy North Carolina accent. And the actress apparently is from Brooklyn and she did a great job, even better job I hear about the Minnesota accent, but I'll never know.
Well, to the extent that your next project does have anything to do with this one, you have to go back and read your first book. Like, I didn't read mine for 10 years, but then when I decided I'd write a sequel, I had to go back and read it again. So you will, just prepare yourself.
Yeah.
You will have to read it.
Yeah. So, yeah. Any other questions? Thank you all. It means the world to see friendly faces and, like I said, being on stage with a celebrity is always wonderful.
It's a beautiful book. It was an honor to be able to be an advanced reader for it. And I think we should bar the door until you go up and place your order first.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you very
Appreciate it. So I guess, I guess that goes like, I can't remember what you're supposed to do. I think you're supposed to go.